Everybody has a story. Everybody's stories matter. Your story this day of your life has more at stake than you or I can possibly imagine. And nobody gets the story that they want. So what I want to talk to you about in these few moments is how to care most deeply about what matters most about your story, to see the drama and adventure in it, and how to not care a tinker's damn about anything else. And when I say that, I don't mean to be glib or superficial. I actually mean that in a very literal way. And I will talk about it by talking today about the story of the most famous tinker who ever lived. A tinker, as you may know, is a mender of pots and pans. And many hundreds of years ago, there was one by the name of John Bunyan. John Bunyan was a Puritan preacher. Puritans took very seriously the call to grow towards Jesus and towards Christ-likeness and towards virtue. And they have taken a lot of hits. In our day, to be a Puritan or to be puritanical is an insult. Marilyn Robinson wrote an essay in 1994 called Puritans and Prigs, and she distinguishes between the two. She points out that Puritans have gotten a lot of bad press, that they are actually very different than the common stereotype of them. They didn't go around wearing black. They were not a joyless people, quite the contrary. She says they were actually the most progressive people up to about the 19th century on the planet. That's why she calls her essay Puritans and Prigs. She says the word priggishness, here's her definition. To be priggish is to be marked by an overvaluing oneself or one's ideas, habits, notions, by precise or inhibited adherence to them, and by a small disparagement of others. So she says what we think of as Puritanism is actually better talked about as priggishness. And the kinds of traits we label Puritan, rigidity, narrowness of mind, judgmentalism, are actually the ones that people display whenever they talk about the Puritans. So, John Bunyan grew up as a Puritan amidst people who took God very, very seriously. He was the tinker and the son of a poor tinker, and in that day, as in the ancient world and often in our day, people who were poor financially were often thought to be poor in spirit, not to have very much to offer. Richard Lisher writes this about John Bunyan, that he suffered from what we might diagnose in our day in childhood as anxiety and depression and ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. And he grew up with all kinds of blasphemous ideas and language about God. He kind of had the notion that, well, if I can't be loved by God, if I'm going to be damned for a few sins, then it might as well be for a lot of them. And tinkers were somewhat known for their cursing. There's a story that emerged later on that a tinker's dam, D-A-M, was actually a small piece of clay that they would use to mend pots or pans. But apparently that is not true. The oldest understanding is that, kind of like people will say, swore like a sailor in our day, tinkers were notorious for really rough language. And the other story was made up by a group of prigs. At any rate, Lisher writes, John Bunyan is a swearer who uses blasphemous language to endow his uneducated speech with authority. It is against the law to curse, and in one brief episode, a townswoman overhears his blasphemies and pronounces him the worst swearer in the entire village and a scourge to youth. Shamed, he pitiably confesses, I wished with all my heart that I might be a little child again, that my father might learn me to speak without this wicked way of swearing. And in those days, in the Puritan world, people would often spend time on what in churches was literally called the anxious bench, trying to work out how do things stand between me and God, with a deep understanding of God's mercy and compassion and holiness and love, but also a deep awareness of my own capacity for self-deception. Now that goes on for John Bunyan for a long, long time. And really, he is brought to God, saved by two things. And those are the two elements that I want to offer to you and me today as we pursue our story and what matters the most, and not caring at all about anything else. One of the things that saved John Bunyan, Richard Lisher says, was the gift that God gave him, the burden that God gave him, and you'll have one of those. That's part of your story. For him, it was to preach, to communicate about God. He wrote a kind of a memoir, Grace Abounding to the Chiefest of Sinners. And he writes about how when he began to feel a great desire to preach to the unsaved, not for the desire of glorifying myself, for at that time I was particularly being afflicted with the fiery darts of the devil concerning my eternal state. In other words, he was afraid that he was going to be damned. I could not rest unless I was exercising this gift of preaching, and I was pressed forward into it. I began to see that the Holy Spirit never intended that people who had gifts and abilities should bury them in the earth. Rather, he commanded and stirred up such people to exercise of their gift, and sent out to work those who were able and ready. And so, although I was the most unworthy of all the saints, I set out upon this work. And so I want to invite you today, whatever gift God has given you, it might be to encourage, it might be the gift of mercy, it might be of giving, it might be of shepherding other people, it might be of sharing your faith with other folks. Whatever it is, use it today in your work, in your relationships, as you are learning. God, thank you that you have given me this gift. Something happens to us when we exercise the gift that God has given us, and we see things happening in our lives that would not normally otherwise happen. I think for me, in some of the darkest days of my life, when a friend of mine said, don't neglect your gift, exercise your gift. And it has been and remains sometimes quite painful to read when, just because of the nature of our story, sometimes people will write, that's a wrong thing, I should not be doing that. And I know what it's like, as Bunyan talks about, to feel like, I don't know if this is right or not, but to say, God, you have given me this gift as best I can. I believe I'm responsible to try to nurture it and develop it and use it for you and use it to try to help other people. And I know how inadequate I am in it. Somehow God is at work in the chiefest of sinners, like John Bunyan, and like you and me. So whatever that gift is today, exercise it. Lisher writes, in addition to preaching, ironically, the other thing that saved John Bunyan was preaching, was prison. Bunyan is saved by prison. As preaching gives him a voice, prison grants him the victory of the saints. The curse of all he has inherited, his poverty and his wickedness, is made worthy by this new instrument of suffering. Bunyan was sent to prison for 12 years, and the charge was preaching without a license. The movement of Puritanism was one that arose in England, initially within the Anglican Church, to try to purify the church. But to preach without a license, because it was in the province of the state at that time, was illegal. John Bunyan was in prison for 12 years for preaching without a license. Had to sleep in a room with 3 other people, cold, damp, made shoelaces to support his family. Fashioned a little flute out of a table leg there so that there could be a little bit of music. And eventually he was released and went to pastor a Baptist church, and then was imprisoned again. And it was in prison that he wrote a book called The Pilgrims Progress. And it is thought, Richard Foster writes about this, that outside of the Bible, published copies of that book have been sold more broadly than any book in the world. And John Bunyan, this educated, blasphemous, cursing tinker, wrote it when he was in prison for preaching without a license. It has been translated into over 200 languages, over 80 languages in Africa alone, and so many phrases that have come from that, and unforgettable characters. It's kind of an allegory about Christian and his friend Faithful and Evangelist, and talkative, all these characters. It's Bunyan's way through story, through story of showing us the drama of our own lives. It's often called Pilgrims Progress, but it was actually the Pilgrims Progress, because it's the story of a particular person, a particular pilgrim, and it's both a travel story and a quest. He's going from the city of destruction to the celestial city, to the city of God, to the kingdom of God. And then it's an adventure story, because in every moment there are these temptations and these problems, and there's the slough of despond, and there is the lure of Vanity Fair. One of the most beautiful moments in this story is one that I want to offer to you right now. He talks about going through the wicket gate of salvation and coming to a cross, and like a tinker would have to carry 60 pounds of tools and instruments on his back to do his work, Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress has to carry on his back the weight of sin and guilt and inadequacy and failure and regret. And I've got that and you've got that, till we come to this place called the cross. Here's what he writes. Thus far did I come, laden with my sin, nor could aught ease the grief that I was in, till I came hither. What a place is this? Must here be the beginning of my bliss? Must here the burden fall off my back? Must here the strings that bound it to me crack? Blessed cross, blessed sepulchre, blessed rather be the man that there was put to shame for me. Blessed be that man, blessed be Jesus. Today, whatever prison that you're in, and we're all in some kind or another, remember that it is uniquely in our sufferings that we meet the man of the cross. Today, whatever your gift is, whether it looks large or small, dramatic or not, thank God for it and use it and craft it. This is my story.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any future teachings from John Ortberg here at Become New. My name's Tim, and I'm a part of the team here. This series is all about stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story matters. And we want to know about your story, whether it's a story of coming to faith or a story of spiritual growth. Whatever it is, we're here for you. You can email that to us at connect@becomenew.com, or you can text it to us. You can also sign up for daily reminders whenever we drop a new video via text by texting the word BECOME to the number 855-888-0444. You can also send us prayer requests there. There's a team of us that meet to pray each weekday for viewers just like yourself. If you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video, be sure to check that out at becomenew.com/subscribe. More than a video to watch, this is really a community to belong to, and we're so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you next time.